Hello and welcome, Magic lovers. A viewer recently asked me about playing 1v1 Commander on a budget. I've been planning on doing a video about this for a while, as I think this information would be useful to a number of players. So I'm going to cover the ways that I think that you can enjoy the 1v1 Commander format while still adhering to a budget. It's important to set some boundaries for what I am considering budget. I think that the minimum budget for 1v1 Commander is an initial investment of $100 to $200 and an ongoing investment of $20 to $40 per month. You can offset some of that initial investment if you already own some of the cards, but it's important to continue investing in the format so that you can pick up new cards as they become available, as well as the cards you are missing. If you can't manage this kind of a budget, unfortunately, I think that it will limit how much you are able to enjoy the format. As an alternative, multiplayer Commander can be played and enjoyed quite fully on a very minuscule budget. If you crave a more competitive alternative, Pauper requires a comparable initial investment, but doesn't require nearly as much on an ongoing basis. Unfortunately, 1v1 Commander is a bit expensive, and any discussion of 1v1 Commander on a budget has to start at a medium budget, not a small one. It's also worth mentioning that I am speaking from the perspective of Magic Online. Although much of the information may apply to Paper Magic as well, I don't play Paper Magic, and I'm not really qualified to speak on the subject. I must also add that all of the information here is just my opinion, and none of it is meant to be considered investment advice in any way. Discussion of budget Magic in just about any format has to include lands. For 1v1 Commander, I think it's important to start with lands because it's a key component of how you choose what decks to play in the first place. As a general rule, 1 and 2 color decks will be significantly less expensive than 4 and 5 color decks. When getting started, I think it's generally better to stick to 1 and 2 color decks. It's also best to avoid red-blue, as Izzet lands often sell at a dramatic premium. I still haven't picked up a copy of Spirebluff now because the standard legal premium plus the blue-red premium makes it a pretty poor value for my purposes. It's also best to avoid decks that play a large number of utility lands, as these can get quite expensive. Azusa and the Gitrog monster both typically play Dark Depths as a win condition, which is already a $15 card, plus the sheer number of $2 and $5 lands will add up quite quickly. These decks lose a lot of efficiency if these lands aren't included. There are still a few decent competitive decks that will fit within this description, and a number of enjoyable rogue decks that are also quite playable. For your trouble, you get the benefit of a very inexpensive mana base. A 2-color deck can still perform quite well with almost entirely basic lands, so don't overthink it too much, although you may want to avoid double mana cost cards that you regularly want to cast on turn 2. I think it's also quite important to talk about enter the battlefield tapped lands. That is, lands that strictly always enter the battlefield tapped. This does not include conditional lands like Ravnica Duels, check lands, and fast lands, which are almost always fine for most decks. 1v1 Commander is a very quick format. You absolutely must be getting value from every single tap land you play in your deck. And fixing your mana is not the value I mean. Your tap lands need to be doing more than that. Man lands are great in the right deck, as are temples. And Karoo lands are at least card advantage, although they can be risky. But the Return to Ravnica Gate cycle and similar lands should pretty much strictly never be played. With almost no exception, you also shouldn't be playing Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, or the Gain 1 Life lands. If you're sticking to the 1 to 2 color rule, you shouldn't really need these lands anyways. And if you're not, then you need to invest in some real dual lands. Further, as a rule of thumb, a deck should not run more than 3 or 4 tapped lands. There are still a number of dual lands that can be obtained quite inexpensively. Check lands, pain lands, and fast lands are all quite inexpensive and certainly worth $1 or $2 each. If you're playing a lot of basics, the battle lands are extremely inexpensive. Also, many of the filter lands, Ravnica Duels, and even some of the true duels are priced quite manageably. It's worth adding that dual lands are well worth investing in. They tend to hold their value well and are usable in many decks across many formats. Even reprints tend to only dip their prices for a short while. See the recent reprintings of Zendikar Fetches as a perfect example. The general trajectory for cost of these lands is up, so it's important to grab the lands that you can while you can. Inevitably, you run into cards that you want for your deck that aren't as affordable as you'd like them to be. When replacing a card in a deck, it's important to note what role that card plays. Some cards are more replaceable than others. For example, while Nissa decks typically run Wasteland, you can probably get away with running Tectonic Edge instead. You may not auto-win the small percentage of games where you can kill an early land and mana screw your opponent, but you'll still generally be able to handle utility lands when needed. By contrast, Gitrog Monster and Titania decks usually play as many sacrifice lands as possible. They also play Crucible Worlds, Rummanak Excavator, and several ways to tutor lands. They want as many Wasteland type effects as they can get, and there is no true replacement for Wasteland itself. You can just run the deck without Wasteland at all, but you'll be giving up a much larger percentage of games than if you ran Nissa without Wasteland. Similarly, Sidisi decks want as much hand disruption as possible, to the point where they are running otherwise awful cards Blackmail and Myra's Toll. There are no true replacements for Liliana or Collective Brutality, and cutting them will definitely have an impact on your deck. You also can't discount the versatility of these cards. With the absence of Baral from the format, the second mode of Liliana is less critical, but it's still very useful in some matchups. It's the versatility of these cards that makes them so useful. There are some cards that are propped up by other formats and just don't have a very good value proposition in this format. This is especially true when a card isn't tutorable and the deck isn't running every possible variant of a type of card available. The previous example notwithstanding, Liliana is a pretty replaceable card in most decks that run it. Similarly, Tarmogoyf and True Name Nemesis can usually be replaced with a similar threat. Leovold is pretty much only played in his own deck, although occasionally in Tasigur decks, and both decks are pretty expensive decks anyways, so it's probably best to avoid them. You may also want to watch out for premiums on standard legal cards. For example, while Chandra, Torch of Defiance, is a great card, it may not be worth the high price tag, to you at least, until it rotates out of standard. Neither Force of Will nor Daze are truly replaceable, but the fact that they're available in the format often has a larger impact on games than if you actually have the card in your hand or not, which you usually won't. I highly recommend that you pick these cards up eventually, especially if you'll be playing some of the more competitive blue decks, but you could probably put them off initially. In order to fully enjoy the format, I think it's really important to continue picking up cards that you're missing, as well as picking up newly printed cards from time to time. In doing so, you want to get the most bang for your buck. To do this, you want to evaluate three factors of the card: how many decks you can play the card in, the impact the card will have on your deck, and of course the cost of the card. It's up to you to determine how to balance these factors, but I can say with experience that being able to play a card in many decks can lead to high satisfaction with buying a card. While expensive, Wasteland and Cavernous Souls are played in virtually every deck in the format. This means you're likely going to draw them quite often, and they will have an impact on the game a high percentage of the time. Similarly, most decks play on-color fetch lands. Their mana fixing ability usually has a medium impact on the game, but some interactions like Crucible Worlds, Rummanak Excavator, and the Gitrog Monster really push the game impact up to 11. With the exception of Scalding Tarn, they are also quite a bit cheaper than Wasteland and Cavernous Souls. So you may decide that you want to pick up some fetch lands, green ones especially, before picking up Wasteland and Cavern, but you might want to pick up Wasteland and Cavern before picking up Scalding Tarn, because Scalding Tarn won't be played in as many decks. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that Force of Will and Daze are playable in basically every blue deck and have a ton of utility in those decks. If you plan on playing much blue in the format, you may want to fit these cards into your purchase plans somewhere. This is all great consideration between sets, but when a new set comes out, especially a Master's set, it's a good idea to consider which cards from the set you might want. There may be a limited window of time where you can pick up the cards at low prices. With a few hard-to-predict exceptions, picking up cards right away isn't a good idea. Low supply and lots of speculation tend to keep prices high. There's usually a point in time, a few weeks after the set is released, where drafting is at its peak and prices are generally the lowest. I picked up my Khan's fetch lands for about $4 each during this time, and Karn for about $7 during peak MM2 draft. I even managed to pick up my Dazes for $5 during peak AMA draft. Despite the very limited print run of that set, a lot of key cards dropped in price very briefly. There are many other examples of cards I picked up for low prices during these peak draft times, and only a handful of cards that never got more expensive or dropped in price afterwards. If you want an easy, just play this deck type answer, then I highly recommend Nissa. It's a reasonably competitive deck, and most deck lists can be obtained for around $200, less if you decide to eschew Wasteland and or Cavern of Souls. If you want really cheap, Zergo Bellstriker decks are less competitive, but run about $100, and many of the cards are somewhat interchangeable. You can also explore a number of rogue strategies, especially if you stick to the 2-color rule. It's often easier to replace cards in rogue decks than it is in established archetypes, and rogue decks can often be a great deal of fun. The ideas I've listed here will at least give you a feel for if you're truly interested in the format. Long term though, I highly recommend picking up Wasteland, Cavern of Soul, and as many fetches as you can. Then start looking at any other cards that round out your decks while attempting to maximize utility over cost. I hope this video helped give you some ideas of how you can enjoy 1v1 Commander while still adhering to a budget, and I really hope you enjoy the format as much as I do. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.